The captain's hat. The hat was the pivot upon which freedom, or death, would turn. It was a wide-brimmed straw planter's hat, stained with sweat and sea salt. It belonged to Captain Relia of the CSS Planter, the Confederate steamship currently idling at Southern Wharf in Charleston, South Carolina. And at 2 a.m. on the moonless, fog-shrouded morning of May 13, 1862, that hat sat on the head of a man who was not Captain Relia. His name was Robert Smalls. He was 23 years old, and he was property. To the Confederacy, he was a slave, a wheelman, trusted only to pilot the armed transport through the intricate, treacherous channels of Charleston's harbor. But to the 7 other enslaved crewmen, now moving like ghosts in the pre-dawn chill, he was their admiral, their Moses, their impossible hope. Robert stood in the pilot house, his hands resting lightly on the great wooden wheel he knew better than his own palms. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the low, steady thrum of the planter's boiler, which he had ordered stoked. Below decks, hidden in the cargo hold, was the true payload: his wife, Hannah, their 4-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, and their infant son, Robert Jr. Beside them huddled the families of the other crewmen, 16 souls in total, betting their lives on this single, audacious lie. The plan was suicidal, simple, yet insane. The white officers, Captain Relia, the mate, and the engineer, had done what they always did when in port. They had left the ship overnight to sleep in their own beds on shore, arrogantly secure in the belief that their loyal slaves would never dare touch the vessel. They were wrong. Robert had been planning this for months, memorizing the signals, the schedules, the tides. He had studied Captain Relia's posture, his walk, the way he held his arms when he stood at the wheel. Tonight, the conditions were perfect. A heavy, wet fog muffled the city, and the tide was turning. It was now or never. "It is time," Robert said, his voice a low tremor that was swallowed by the fog. His brother John Smalls and fellow crewman Abraham Alston cast off the thick mooring ropes. With a soft splash, they fell into the dark, oily water. Robert pulled the engine lever. Slowly, silently, the planter's paddle wheel began to turn, churning the harbor's black water. The ship, a 150-foot side-wheel steamer armed with a 32-pounder pivot gun and a 24-pounder howitzer, slid away from the wharf. It moved with agonizing slowness, a phantom stealing itself. Robert's first objective was a nearby wharf where the families had been waiting, hidden in the shadow of a warehouse. He brought the planter alongside, a masterful maneuver in the dark that barely caused a ripple. One by one, the women and children were pulled aboard, their bare feet silent on the damp deck. Hannah found him in the pilot house, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it was almost silent. "Robert," she whispered, clutching the baby, "are they—" "I am sleeping," he said, not taking his eyes off the water. "And we are leaving." He pointed the planter's bow toward the harbor mouth, toward the sea, toward the Union blockade. But freedom was not a straight line. Between them and the open ocean lay a gauntlet of Confederate defenses, a deadly constellation of forts and batteries designed to stop the Union fleet. They would have to sail directly past them all. The first was Castle Pinckney. It loomed from the fog, a dark mass of brick. A sentinel on duty would surely spot the planter, a ship known to all, moving at an unauthorized hour. "Get down," Robert ordered the others on deck. "Stay out of sight." He stood alone in the pilot house, the straw hat pulled low. He was a black man in a white man's hat, impersonating a white captain. He prayed the fog and the darkness would be enough to blur the lines of his race, leaving only the silhouette of authority. He saw a light flash on the fort's rampart, a challenge. Robert's hand went to the steam whistle's pull cord. His mind raced. He knew the signals. He had listened to them every day. 2 long blasts, followed by a short one. The correct signal for a transport vessel. He pulled the cord. The planter's roar of the whistle ripped through the quiet morning, echoing off the water. It sounded impossibly loud, a scream announcing their theft. They waited. The ship glided forward. Robert could feel the sweat trickling down his back, cold in the damp air. From the fort, a lantern flashed twice. Pass. They had bought the lie. Robert let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. But the worst was yet to come. Looming ahead, guarding the very mouth of the harbor, was the most formidable fortress in North America, the place where the war itself had begun. Sumter Fort. The Sumter Salute. Sumter Fort was not just a fort, it was a symbol. Its massive brick walls, though scarred from the bombardment that had opened the Civil War, bristled with heavy artillery. It was the sleeping dragon they now had to tiptoe past. As the Planter approached the fort, the fog began to thin, replaced by the pale, sickly gray of first light. This was the most dangerous moment. The darkness that had been their ally was now abandoning them. Soon the gunners on Sumter's ramparts would be able to see the pilot house clearly. They would see the face of the man at the wheel. Robert's hands tightened on the polished wood. He could feel the 16 heartbeats of the people hiding below deck, a collective prayer of terror and hope. Hannah was just below him. He could almost feel her fear radiating up through the floorboards. "Now, Robert," he whispered to himself, "be the captain." He squared his shoulders. He crossed his arms over his chest, exactly as he had seen Captain Relia do 100 times when passing the fort. He adopted the captain's slight lean. From a distance, in the grainy light, he was no longer Robert the slave. He was Captain Relia, a white man in a straw hat, confidently piloting his vessel. A challenge light flashed from the fort. Robert knew the response. He reached for the pull cord again. This was the ultimate test. His whistle signal had to be perfect, not just the right sequence, but the right tone. Confident, routine. He gave the required signal. 2 long, 1 short. The Planter's deep whistle echoed across the water, a polite greeting from one part of the Confederate war machine to another. The ship continued to glide. Robert did not breathe. He stared straight ahead, a statue of command, forcing himself not to look at the massive cannons pointed directly at his ship. He knew that a single nervous glance, a moment of hesitation, would betray him. A minute passed. It felt like a lifetime. The Planter was almost directly abeam the fort. Then, from the ramparts, an answer. A Confederate soldier, silhouetted against the graying sky, waved a lazy hand. A lantern flashed the all-clear. On the fort's flagstaff, the Confederate stars and bars waved sluggishly in the dawn breeze. They had passed. Robert Smalls, a slave, had just saluted the heart of the Confederacy while stealing one of its warships from under its very nose. He kept the ship at a steady, unhurried pace. To flee now, to pour on the steam, would be to admit guilt. He had to maintain the illusion until he was clear of Sumter's massive guns. He counted the seconds, the paddle wheel turning. Thump, thump, thump. Finally, they were past the last Confederate outpost, Fort Moultrie, and the harbor opened up into the vast, churning gray of the Atlantic Ocean. A wild, ecstatic cheer erupted from the men who had been hiding. They ran onto the deck, laughing and crying, pulling their wives and children up from the hold.
Hannah rushed to Robert, tears streaming down her face, and threw her arms around him at the wheel. "We've done it, Robert. We're free." Robert kissed his wife, his own eyes burning. "Not yet, Hannah," he said, his voice thick. "Not yet." He pointed ahead. On the horizon, dark smudges against the rising sun. They were the ships of the Union blockade. They had escaped the Confederacy. Now they had to survive the Union. To the approaching U.S. Navy warships, the Planter was an enemy gunboat, armed and steaming directly for them in an aggressive posture. They were in more danger now than they had been passing Sumter. "Quickly," Robert yelled, his voice now a true command. "The flag! Get the flag down!"
Abraham Alston scrambled to the mast and tore down the red, white, and blue Confederate flag. "What do we raise?" shouted John Smalls. "They'll fire on us before we get close." Hannah knew. She had prepared for this. While Robert had planned the escape, she had planned the surrender. She ran back to the cabin and returned with a white bedsheet. "Here," she cried, "this is our flag now." They tied the bedsheet to the mast and ran it up. It flapped desperately in the wind, a universal symbol of surrender, a plea for mercy. Robert pushed the Planter's engine to its maximum. He steered directly for the largest of the Union vessels, the USS Onward. A puff of white smoke erupted from the Onward's bow, followed a second later by the boom of a cannon, a warning shot. The cannonball skipped across the waves, perilously close. The next one would not be a warning. Robert grabbed the ship's bell and began to ring it frantically. The men on deck waved the white sheet, screaming across the water. "We're friends! We're escaping! We're slaves!" On the Onward, they could see sailors scrambling, the gun ports opening. They were preparing a full broadside. "They can't hear us!" Hannah screamed. "They will," Robert said. He held his course. It was the final gamble. He was betting his family's life that the men on that ship would see the white flag and the color of the faces on the deck before they pulled the lanyard. The Planter steamed closer. 500 yards. 400 yards. Suddenly, the activity on the Union ship changed. An officer on the Onward's deck, peering through a spyglass, lowered it and shouted an order. The gun ports remained open, but the men paused. Robert Smalls brought the Planter skillfully alongside the Union warship, cutting the engine. The silence was deafening. A Union officer, Captain Nichols, looked down from the towering deck of the Onward at the battered steamship and its ragged crew. He looked at the women, the children, and finally at the man in the pilot house who was now taking off his hat. Robert Smalls stood tall. The morning sun lit his face. "Good morning, sir," Robert called out, his voice clear and steady across the water. "I have brought you some of the first fruits of the Confederacy. I am Robert Smalls, and this is the gunboat Planter. We are contraband, sir, come to join the Union fleet." The price of intelligence. For a long moment, the only sounds were the creak of the Onward's hull and the gentle lap of the Atlantic against the stolen Planter. Captain Nichols stared down at the black man who had just delivered a fully armed Confederate gunboat, complete with its artillery and cargo of cannon. "Heavens!" a Union sailor next to Nichols whispered. "They're all colored." Nichols' military suspicion warred with sheer astonishment. He had been expecting a Confederate trick, a Trojan horse. Instead, he got a delivery. "Board them," Nichols commanded, his voice tight. A swarm of blue-jacketed Union sailors, cutlasses drawn and rifles ready, dropped onto the Planter's deck. The escaped families huddled together, the children wailing, terrified that this new set of white men would be just as brutal as the last. "We mean no harm," Robert shouted, raising his hands. "We are for the Union." A young lieutenant stepped up to Robert, his eyes sweeping over the pilot house, the pivot gun, and the pale, terrified faces of the women. "Who are you?" "I am Robert Smalls, sir. I was the wheelman of this vessel. The white officers are ashore in Charleston. I am bringing this ship, its crew, and our families to you as a prize of war." The lieutenant's jaw went slack. He looked at the straw planter's hat Robert still clutched, and then at the white bedsheet hanging from the mast. He, like everyone in the Union fleet, had heard rumors of dissatisfied slaves, but this was audacity on an epic scale. "Secure the vessel," the lieutenant ordered his men, his voice cracking with excitement, "and bring this man to Captain Nichols, now." Robert was hustled aboard the Onward. He walked onto the deck of the Union warship, not as a cargo, not as property, but as a man who had forced his own freedom. The Union sailors stared at him, their expressions a mix of disbelief and a strange, nascent respect. He was covered in coal soot and sweat. His clothes were rags, but he walked with the bearing of the captain he had pretended to be. He was taken immediately to Flag Officer Samuel Francis DuPont, commander of the South Atlantic Blockade Squadron, aboard his flagship, the majestic USS Wabash. DuPont was a formidable man, a product of a naval dynasty, known for his stern discipline and meticulous planning. He sat in his great cabin, charts of the Carolina coast spread across a massive mahogany table. When Robert was brought in, DuPont looked up, his steel-gray eyes appraising. "They tell me," he began, his voice a low, aristocratic rumble, "that you have stolen this vessel." "Yes, sir," Robert said, his heart still pounding. "She is the CSS Planter. I was the wheelman of it." "You know the harbor." It wasn't a question. "I know it better than any man, sir, white or black." DuPont leaned forward. This was the moment. The Union Navy had been stalled for months, unable to crack the fortress of Charleston. They were blind. This man could be their eyes. "Tell me," DuPont said, pointing to a chart. "We are planning an assault here, in the Stono Inlet." Robert looked at the chart. He knew these waters. He had carried supplies to the batteries there just days ago. "You should not, sir," Robert said simply. "Explain." "The maps are wrong. The channel has shifted. But more than that, the batteries on Coles Island and Folly Island, they are abandoned. The Rebs pulled the guns last week to move them inland. They left dummy guns, logs painted black, to fool your ships." A stunned silence filled the cabin. DuPont stared at Robert and then at his subordinate officers. They had been planning to shell a phantom position. "How do you know this?" DuPont demanded. "Because I carried the last of their supplies, sir. I piloted the officers to the landing. I heard them speak. They did not mind me." Robert felt a lifetime of indignation rise in his throat. This was the great, fatal arrogance of the South. He was invisible, a tool, a piece of furniture that could steer a boat. And so they had discussed everything in front of him: troop movements, harbor defenses, new mine locations, codes. "They talk in front of us," Robert continued, his voice gaining power. "They spell out their plans believing we are too ignorant to understand and too cowardly to act. They are wrong on both counts, sir." For the next 2 hours, Robert Smalls held a master class on the defenses of Charleston. He moved his finger across the admiral's charts, correcting them from memory. "Here," he would say, "the water is too shallow now, but here you can bring a gunboat within 300 yards of the city. The torpedoes they've laid are here, here, and here. The signal for passing Sumter is 2 long, 1 short. The password for the weak is Sumter. The new battery on Sullivan's Island is weak from the landward side." He was a human gold mine. The officers in the cabin scribbled frantically, their eyes wide. This 23-year-old slave, who was legally forbidden to read or write, possessed a more accurate and devastatingly complete picture of Charleston's defenses than the entire Union intelligence network. By the time the sun was high in the sky, Robert had given DuPont the keys to the kingdom. DuPont, profoundly impressed, leaned back. "Mr. Smalls," he said, and the "Mr." landed with the force of a cannon shot. It was the first time a white man in authority had ever addressed him with such respect. "You have done the Union a great service. What is it you desire?" Robert thought of Hannah. He thought of his children, who were at that moment on the deck of the Wabash, being given hardtack and fresh water by smiling sailors, their first meal as free people. "Freedom, sir," Robert said, "for my family and a chance to fight." The hero and the hunted. The news exploded across the North. It was the story newspapers craved, a narrative of pure, distilled heroism that cut through the bloody stalemate of the war. "A slave's daring escape," screamed the headlines in Harper's Weekly. "A Negro steals a rebel gunboat." Overnight, Robert Smalls became one of the most famous men in America. He was the living refutation of the Southern lie. The Confederacy argued that slaves were docile, happy, and intellectually inferior. Robert Smalls had just proven them to be brilliant, courageous, and desperate for freedom. He was a symbol, a hero, a celebrity. Congress moved with uncharacteristic speed. They passed a special bill authorizing the U.S. government to appraise the Planter and its cargo. As prize money, Robert Smalls and his crew were awarded half the vessel's value. Robert's personal share with $1,500, the equivalent of over $45,000 today. He was now a free man and a wealthy one. He was brought to Washington, D.C., where he met with Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. He was received in the White House by President Abraham Lincoln, who was deeply moved by the quiet, dignified pilot's story. For Lincoln, struggling with the question of emancipation and the arming of black troops, Smalls was a powerful argument in favor of both. But while the North celebrated him, the South cursed him. In Charleston, the news of his escape was met with sheer panic and humiliation. That a trusted slave could commit such an act of treason struck at the very heart of the Confederate social order. If Robert Smalls could do this, which one of them was next? An editorial in the Charleston Mercury called for the blackest, most hellish vengeance upon him. The Confederate government officially declared him a fugitive and a thief, and placed a staggering $4,000 bounty on his head, dead or alive. Captain Relea and the Planter's other officers were court-martialed for dereliction of duty. Robert Smalls was now officially the most hunted black man in America. He could have taken his prize money and lived a safe, comfortable life in the North. No one would have blamed him. He had won. But for Robert Smalls, the war was not over. His people were still in chains. The Union had given him his freedom, and now he intended to use it to free the rest. He went back to South Carolina. He returned to the USS Wabash and offered his services to Admiral DuPont. He wanted to be a pilot. DuPont, remembering the man's encyclopedic knowledge of the coast, immediately agreed. Robert Smalls was assigned as a civilian pilot to the U.S. Navy, attached to the very fleet blockading the harbor he had fled. His job? To guide Union warships through the treacherous, mine-filled channels that only he truly knew. His first assignment was to guide the gunboat USS Crusader into the Stono Inlet, the very spot he had warned DuPont about. Based on his intelligence, the Union fleet now knew the Confederate batteries were abandoned. They steamed in unopposed, capturing a key strategic position and securing a beachhead near Charleston. Robert Smalls, the former slave, was now leading the Union invasion of his former home. But his greatest test, the moment that would turn him from a hero into a legend, was yet to come. And it would come aboard the very ship he had stolen. The Union Navy, recognizing its value, had refitted the CSS Planter and recommissioned it as the USS Planter, and Robert Smalls was about to find himself in the captain's chair once more, this time with the shells screaming at him. The captain in spite of himself.
December 1, 1863. The war had ground on, and the Union's grip on the South Carolina coast had tightened, thanks in no small part to the intelligence Robert Smalls had provided. The USS Planter was no longer the Confederate transport Robert had stolen. It was now a U.S. Navy dispatch boat, battered and stained from relentless service, but proud. Robert was its pilot, the highest-paid black man in the U.S. Navy, but he was not its captain. Command was reserved for white officers. On this cold December day, the Planter was ordered up the Folly Island Creek, a narrow, winding artery of water near Secessionville, just south of Charleston. Their mission was to deliver supplies and survey Confederate positions. In command was a white officer named Nickerson. Robert knew this creek. He knew every mudflat, every oyster bed, every blind turn. He also knew it was a perfect place for an ambush. "Captain," he said, his voice respectful but firm, as he stood at the wheel. "Begging your pardon, sir, but the Rebs have a new battery on that bluff. We're sailing into a kill box." Captain Nickerson, new to the area and dismissive of the local pilot, waved a hand. "Your job is to steer, Mr. Smalls, not to set strategy. The intelligence says the battery is unmanned. Proceed." Robert's jaw tightened. He had learned in his 2 years of service that official intelligence was often wrong, and the men who paid the price were the ones on the deck. But he was a pilot, not the captain. He obeyed the order. He guided the Planter around a bend. The water was unnervingly still. The shore was silent, too silent. Then the bluff erupted. Whoomp, crack, boom! A full Confederate battery, hidden in the brush, opened fire at point-blank range. The first shell screamed over the smokestack. The second exploded in the water just off the bow, sending a geyser of black mud and water drenching the deck. "Ambush!" a lookout screamed. Chaos erupted. Shells began to find their mark. A 24-pounder shot ripped through the wooden bulwarks, sending a spray of deadly splinters across the deck. Men cried out. The small ship was a perfect target, trapped in the narrow channel with no room to maneuver. In the pilot house, Robert wrestled with the wheel, trying to turn the ship in the tight confines. Crash! A shell struck the pilot house itself, shattering the glass and wood. Robert was thrown to the deck, his ears ringing. He tasted blood. He looked up, expecting to hear Captain Nickerson's commands. But the captain was gone. He scrambled to his feet and looked out. He saw Captain Nickerson, his face pale with terror, abandoning his post. The commander was sprinting for the safest part of the ship, the iron-plated engine room, to hide behind the boiler. The crew saw it too. The gunners, left without orders, froze. They were leaderless, taking heavy fire, and seconds from annihilation or surrender. Surrender, for the black crewman, meant certain execution. In that instant, Robert Smalls was faced with the same choice he made in Charleston Harbor. He could follow the rules and die, or he could break them and live. He stood up, wiping the blood from his brow. The Confederate guns were reloading. They had seconds. "This is not our day to die," Robert roared, his voice cutting through the panic. He seized the wheel. He was no longer a pilot. He was the captain. "Fire!" he bellowed at the stunned gun crew. "Fire on that bluff! Keep their heads down!" The crew, hearing the voice of command, snapped back to life. They loaded the Planter's bow gun and returned fire.
"Engine room," Robert shouted down the voice tube. "Full steam astern, now!" The cowardly captain was in the engine room, but the engineer, a freedman named Ebenezer, was loyal to Robert. The paddle wheel began to churn violently, pulling the ship backward. Robert spun the wheel, executing a masterful, desperate maneuver, backing the ship into a wider part of the creek while shells bracketed their position. He was steering a 150-foot vessel in reverse, under heavy artillery fire, in a channel barely wide enough for the ship.
He didn't just stand in the pilot house, he stood out on the exposed deck where he could better see the channel. Shrapnel whizzed past his head. He was a visible target, the lone black man commanding his ship. He was channeling all the rage of a lifetime, all his intimate knowledge of these waters, into this one act of defiance. He was the most wanted man in the Confederacy, and he was steering his ship right back into their teeth to get out. "Again!" he roared as the bow gun fired. The Planter shuddered as another shot grazed its hull, but Robert held the course. He skillfully navigated the turn, the paddle wheel digging deep, and then, finally, the ship was out of the narrowest part of the channel and slipping past the Confederate battery's line of fire. As they rounded the last bend and slid into the safety of the main river, the Confederate guns fell silent, cheated of their prize. The Planter was heavily damaged. It was smoking. There were wounded men on the deck, but it was floating, and it was free. The crew, white sailors and black sailors alike, stared at Robert Smalls with a silent, profound awe. He had not just saved their ship, he had saved every soul aboard it. He simply nodded, his hands still gripping the wheel, his knuckles white. When they limped back to the Union fleet's anchorage at Hilton Head, Captain Nickerson emerged from the engine room, his uniform stained with coal dust and shame. The incident was reported immediately, but it wasn't Robert who was in trouble. The entire crew, including the white sailors, testified to their commander's cowardice and Robert's extraordinary courage. The story raced through the fleet. Admiral Dahlgren, the fleet's new commander, summoned Robert. "Mr. Smalls," the admiral said, his face grim, "I have read the report. Captain Nickerson has been relieved of duty and will face a court-martial." Robert stood at attention. "I see, sir." "What I do not see," the admiral continued, a slight smile playing on his lips, "is a captain for the USS Planter. The men will not serve under anyone else. They say you are the only man fit for the job." Robert Smalls, the man born a slave, the man with a $4,000 bounty on his head, the man who was not legally a U.S. citizen, looked the admiral in the eye. "Sir," Robert said, "I am." In a move that shattered centuries of precedent, Admiral Dahlgren officially promoted Robert Smalls to the rank of captain. He was given command of the USS Planter and a salary of $150 a month, making him one of the highest-ranking and highest-paid black men in the service of the United States. He had stolen the ship as a slave. Now he commanded it as a captain. Captain Smalls would command the Planter for the rest of the war. He would run the Confederate blockade, deliver dispatches, lay mines, and ferry troops. He was present in Charleston Harbor for the official flag-raising ceremony at Fort Sumter in April 1865, the very day President Lincoln was assassinated. He had sailed out of that harbor in darkness, a thief and a fugitive. He sailed back in triumph, a Union captain, steering his own ship, having witnessed the total collapse of the system that had once owned him.
A new kind of fight. When the guns fell silent in 1865, Robert Smalls returned to the ruins of Charleston. The city was a ghost of its former self, scarred by fire and defeat. He had money, his prize money and his captain's salary. He could have gone anywhere, but he went back to Beaufort, South Carolina, the town where he was born, the town where his mother had been a slave. He walked down the main street, a free man, a war hero, and a community leader. He and Hannah wanted a home. He found one, a beautiful two-story house at 511 Prince Street. It was the very house where he had been a slave, the house where his former master, Henry McKee, had lived. It was being sold at a tax auction. Robert Smalls walked up the steps and bought the home of the man who had once owned him and his mother. In an act of incredible grace, when he later learned that McKee's wife was elderly and destitute, he allowed her to live in the house with his family until her death. But the fight was not over. It had just changed form.
The period was called Reconstruction, the nation's fragile, violent attempt to rebuild the South and integrate 4 million newly freed people. Smalls learned to read and write, a skill that had been denied him by law. He learned with the same ferocious, focused intelligence he had used to memorize the harbor. He saw that the new weapon in this fight was not a cannon, but the ballot box. He saw that his people, while free, were uneducated and unprotected, surrounded by a white population that was defeated but not repentant. In 1868, he was elected to the South Carolina House of Representatives. His former masters were horrified. The man who used to serve them dinner, the man they had hunted, was now writing their laws. He was a natural. He was charismatic, eloquent, and most importantly, he was fearless. He had faced down Fort Sumter and Confederate batteries. He was not intimidated by angry plantation owners in the state legislature. He championed a radical idea: public education. He argued with the moral force of a man who had been forbidden to read that every child, black and white, deserved a free education paid for by the state. He helped draft the legislation that created the first public school system in South Carolina's history. But his ambition was larger. The new, rewritten U.S. Constitution now said a man like him could serve. In 1874, the people of the 5th Congressional District, a district that included his home of Beaufort, elected him to the United States Congress. Robert Smalls, the boy who had been born a slave, now walked the halls of the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. as Congressman Smalls. His fight was now against the rising, toxic tide of white supremacy. The Redeemers of the South, groups like the Ku Klux Klan, were using terror, murder, and intimidation to strip black people of their new rights. In Congress, Smalls was a fierce, passionate orator. He fought against voter intimidation. He argued for the integration of the U.S. military. He stood on the floor of the House of Representatives and, in a debate with a former Confederate general, calmly recounted the story of his escape, proving that the courage and intelligence of the black race were beyond question. But the tide was turning against him. Reconstruction was failing. In 1876, a violent, fraudulent election swept the old Confederate Guard back into power in South Carolina. They were led by a former Confederate general named Wade Hampton. They were determined to destroy Robert Smalls. They couldn't beat him with votes, so they tried to beat him with the law. They fabricated a charge against him, accusing him of taking a bribe, a charge that was transparently false. He was convicted by an all-white jury in a kangaroo court. But Smalls was not a man who stayed down. He appealed. He fought. The South Carolina governor, a Redeemer Democrat, offered him a pardon. A pardon, Smalls knew, implied guilt. He refused it. He would accept only full exoneration or he would go to prison. His enemies, realizing the political fallout of jailing the nation's greatest black war hero, backed down. He would be re-elected and serve 5 terms in Congress, a beacon of hope in an increasingly dark time. He was the last of the black congressmen from that era to be pushed from office, finally defeated in 1886 by a system of gerrymandering and voter suppression that would usher in the long, dark night of Jim Crow. He returned to Beaufort. He was an old man now. He had been a slave, a pilot, a hero, a captain, and a congressman. He accepted a final post, U.S. Collector of Customs for the Port of Beaufort, a position he held for over 20 years, a symbol of federal authority in the heart of the Old South. He lived out his days in the house where he had been a slave, watching the 20th century dawn. He saw the nation he had fought for, the nation he had helped legislate, betray its promise to his people. But Robert Smalls never lost his dignity. He never lost his fight. When he died in 1915, he was 75 years old. He died a free man, in his own bed, in his own house, a legend. He had started his life as a piece of property, valued at a few $100s. He ended it as one of the great, improbable heroes in American history. He had not just stolen a ship. He had stolen a future for himself, for his family, and for his nation. And he did it all, starting on a dark night, with nothing but courage, an impossible plan, and a captain's hat.